Hello, everybody. I don't have a mic, but this room seems good acoustically. I hope everybody can hear me. Yes. All right, great. So I'm Raia Hadsell, your latest guest speaker for this course. I'm at DeepMind, as I guess all of the guest speakers are for this course. I have been at DeepMind for about 4 years, and I lead a research group in the deep learning team. In particular, my research focuses on aspects of continual learning, lifelong learning, transfer learning. So I think that that's actually incredibly important for getting deep learning, deep reinforcement learning to work in the real world. I also work on robotics and miscellaneous other topics that come up. And so I'm going to talk about sort of 3 topics, and then if I have time, then I've got a little segment at the end that shows some research that have been working on recently, which maybe gives you just sort of a fast forward to just a method, the details of a method that's currently out there being published. But I'm going to talk a fair amount about topics in computer vision. So this is actually a continuation of what Karen Simonian presented, I think, 2 weeks ago. So forget everything that Oriel said last week and remember what Karen said. And I will be continuing from that, starting with talking about beyond simple image recognition or image classification. So I wanted to, so quick overview, talking about end-to-end learning as we go to more complex architectures and more complex tasks. Also doing a little case study of an end-to-end trained architecture, the spatial transformer network. Then learning without labels, so how to learn an embedding or a manifold if you don't have supervised labels, you don't want to use them. And then, like I said, a topic on using reinforcement learning, sequence learning, auxiliary losses together for a navigation problem, a maze navigation problem. First of all, end-to-end learning. It's a familiar term. I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page about it. Somebody tell me what end-to-end learning means. Someone.
Everything's differentiable and can be everything's differentiable.
Right, so fundamentally, we're talking about methods that we can optimize all the way from some input or all the way to an output that we want. And that everything in the middle should be optimized together. And usually we do this by differentiable approaches such that we can use gradient descent methods to optimize the whole thing at once, end to end. And I have a little slide that I use when I'm trying to convince people that aren't necessarily into deep learning why end-to-end learning is important. So this is a, proof via history. So in 2010, the state of the art in speech recognition looked like this. You started out with, for speech recognition, I've got an audio signal that comes in, and I want to predict text from it, right? That's speech recognition. And so the state of the art for doing this involved having a nice acoustic model, a nice phonetic model, and a nice language model. All good machine learning problems in and of themselves, but a modular approach, right? Each of these things were optimized separately, but these definitely gave us the state of the art in speech recognition, which was not bad in 2010. Then in 2010, things changed. The state of the art was handed off to a deep neural network that trained the whole pipeline end to end, going all the way from the output that we want text back through back to audio and getting an improvement in that. So sort of throwing away the understanding of the domain experts that said, well, first we need to get we need to get the phonemes, we need to have the language model, we need to have these different explicit components. In 2012, computer vision, state of the art was something that maybe was like this, obviously different variations of it, but it involved extracting some key points in an image, computing SIFT features, some other robust feature, maybe training a deformable part model, and before you get out labels. So pixels to labels via this sort of modular pipeline of separately trained models. And of course, this was exceeded by a lot in the ImageNet challenge using a deep neural network that simply took pixels in, output labels. Again, in 2014, machine translation, text in, text out, and this has also the state of the art since 2014 has been different flavors of deep neural networks. So right now, state of the art in robotics looks like this. You have your sensors, you do some perception on those sensory streams. You maybe put these into a map or a world model. Then you do some planning, and then you send some control actions to the robot before actually producing the actions. To me, I really like robotics, and I would love to see this method replaced again with end-to-end learning, because I think that it's obvious that there is a potential here to take exactly that, to take this domain and do the same thing. It's harder for robotics. I'm not going to talk about it today, but I just like to sort of think about this as a reason for why it's good to learn things end-to-end. Do you buy that? Is it a convincing argument? All right. Let's talk about beyond ImageNet classification. And so one thing that we can do, so Karen talked about how to train convolutional neural networks to solve sort of ImageNet type of problems, I believe. I hope that's what he talked about. Yes, good. And so let's make the point first about pre-training. So training big models on big data sets takes a lot of time. It can take several weeks on multiple GPUs to train for ImageNet. Maybe not anymore. Used to take several weeks. Still takes a while and a fair amount of resources. But the network trained on a big data set like ImageNet should be useful for other data. Especially if we have similar classes or a similar domain, but actually people have shown that they can take a network trained on ImageNet and use those features and use that for a wide variety of new types of problems and in different domains. And that's really, I think, the exciting thing about the ImageNet work, both the data set and the approach. So how do we make use of a trained model? So we train our model, we train our big neural network, we then plug it into another network, and we train whatever layers we have that were not replaced using these pre-trained layers. And then we can keep those pre-trained weights fixed, or we can slowly update them. So this is a simple process. So step A, train the ConvNet on ImageNet, which produces as the output a 1,000-dimensional ImageNet class likelihood vector. We keep some number of layers there, sometimes all of them, whatever that model is, sometimes only some of them out of that layer. And we initialize a new ConvNet using some of those pre-trained layers. And then we can say, well, I've got a last layer, or I've maybe got a couple last layers. In this case, the output for detection might be a 21-dimensional class likelihood for Pascal VOC. Or I guess it's not detection, but classification. And so we just retrain that last layer. That can speed things up dramatically, and it can also provide actually a better result, especially if you don't have enough data in that new data set. All right, let's look at a couple of other image recognition tasks. Image classification just says there's a person, there's a sheep, there's a dog. Or in the case of ImageNet, I always find ImageNet strange because you take an image like that and the desired output label is simply dog. So it just outputs a single layer and throws away anything else in the image. So image classification is fairly blunt. Let's think about harder tasks. So we might want to do object localization or detection. So that means we actually want a bounding box around different things, basically. That's saying I want a classification of what the object is and also a bound around where it is. And implied in that is that it means that if there are multiple sheep, for instance, we would want to identify all of them. Semantic segmentation, definitely quite a bit more challenging because here we want pixel-wise labels. So we want to be able to have a pixel-wise boundary around the different elements in the scene. And instant segmentation is we actually want to know where things are different. We don't want to just know sheep. We want to know sheep A, B, C, D, and E. All right, so object detection with convnets. A popular approach that was used sort of initially is just to say, well, detection is just a classification problem everywhere in the image. So let's just sweep a sliding window across the whole image in all positions, preferably at all scales as well. And we'll just feed each of those individual bounding boxes into a classifier, which will say yes or no for all of the different classes. This is actually not quite as bad as it sounds. It's bad if you do it naively. It can be done it can be done with a little bit more optimization so that it's not horrible, but it's just not great. You end up with the same object gets detected multiple times. So you would get sort of multiple 20 different detections of the person with jitter around it. And you also, so yeah, you get that the same object gets detected multiple times, and you also are sort of assuming that you have just a fixed number of sizes of bounding boxes and aspect ratios. Instead, you could say, well, I'm just going to directly predict the bounding box. So there you say, where's an object? Let me just regress 4 numbers, the coordinates of the box. So you can just directly use a mean squared error loss and say, I want to regress the pixel coordinates of the top left corner and the bottom right corner, for instance. And this is not as, it actually works. It's sort of a strange thing to ask a neural network to do. At least I've always thought that, but it sort of works. Sort of a problem though, the number of boxes is unknown, and it doesn't work as well as other approaches. And the last sort of general method for doing object detection is to to take some bounding box proposals, which might come from a trained network, and say for each of those proposals of where there might be a bounding box, let's classify if there's actually an object there or not. Let's look a little bit more as to what that looks like. And then those proposals get passed through a classifier, and we can decide if they're actually, if there's actually something there or not. And this provides something that looks a little bit like attention. So instead of looking at the whole network, I'm going to first use one classifier to say, here's some candidate places to look. Now I look at just those places more closely, and I decide, I refine that bounding box, and I say yes or no, what sort of object is in there. And this is a lot faster because we're not exhaustively considering the whole image. There's no reason to sweep a window across a big field of empty space or a big blue sky. We immediately sort of home in on possible objects. And so this is, I'll talk for a couple slides about faster RCNN. RCNN stands for region CNN. And this has gone through a couple of iterations in the last couple of years with people coming up with refinements on the basic approach. So we start with convolutional layers that are pre-trained on ImageNet. And then there is a proposal stage where we have a one network here that looks at the feature layer, the feature layers of the ConvNet, and says, I'm going to produce a number of proposals. And these are bounding box estimates. Then you fill in those bounding boxes with the actual details and send it to a classifier. And that classifier is going to refine the location, like I said, and decide what class of object is in there, if any. And also maybe do some region of interest pooling if you have sort of multiple detections in the same area. Yes?
Can you propagate through this, like flopping the proposal bounding box?
Yes, you can. So, I will actually go to the next slide because it offers a little bit more details here as to what's actually happening here. And there might actually be, I thought there might be a little bit more details on the actual equations. But let me talk about this, and maybe then it's a little bit more clear. So what we do, start with we have a convolutional feature map, and we slide a window across there, but it's sort of a big coarse window. For each position of that window, we actually look at a selection of what we call, what are called anchor boxes. And these offer a variety of different aspect ratios. There's sort of a bunch of templates that says, let's look at these different coarse sort of shapes in the image. And for each of these, then we're going to predict whether or not there are these different boxes, with these different anchor boxes with respect to this anchor location. And we're going to predict if the proposal contains an object. Let's see here. So we take this sliding window, and we take the anchor boxes, and we're actually considering the content in there. And that's what makes this differentiable, is that we still have a sliding window approach. We're just considering a limited number of different options. And then we go through an intermediate layer that's got 256 hiddens there. And then we can produce two things here. One is for each of those anchor positions, then what are the scores with regard to whether or not there's an object there, and then a refinement on the coordinates. And one of the most important things here, this looks similar to the other approach, but the important thing here is that everything's in reference to that fixed, to this sliding window location. It's anchored there. So when we are predicting what the new coordinates are and how to refine that bounding box, then it is relative to this central position. And that makes the neural network a lot more able to scale and makes it truly translation invariant across the entire image space, which is important. Otherwise, if you're asking the neural network to produce information about whether or not this bounding box should be moved to, pixel 687 versus 689, then those aren't numbers that neural networks work with very well, with a lot of precision. And so this is used instead of this approach. Well, I'm not sure exactly what this cartoon is supposed to show, but I think it shows that we're producing proposals separately. And here we're not. We're really just considering we're refining this this method of scrolling across the entire image space. It's a little bit more like a very structured convolutional layer because it's looking everywhere at these different aspect ratios. And to further improve the performance, we can always, because this is differentiable, Then we can backprop all the way through to this, to the convolutional stack and to those feature layers and make them a little bit better, a little bit more sensitive, which is important. Sometimes when we get at the end of training on ImageNet, we get these we don't get crisp locations. If we want to get bounding boxes, we need crisp locations in the image. So it can be useful to pre-train. You get a little bit different feature representation that way. All right, next, let's talk for a moment about semantic segmentation. So semantic segmentation means that we are going to label each pixel in the input image into one of the different object classes that we have available. And the usual way this is done is to classify each pixel for each class so that you end up getting the output of your system is going to be a full resolution map, so the same resolution as the input image, but with the number of channels that's equal to the number of classes you have, and each of those layers is a binary mask that looks for each different class, or has a likelihood in it that hasn't been thresholded. And so one of the important things here when we consider doing semantic segmentation using a convolutional network is that what happens at the end of a convolutional network? We have pooled and we have lost resolution so that we end up with something that's very semantically laden at the end of say, an ImageNet ConvNet, but we don't anymore have any spatial resolution. So going back to the full resolution input size is sort of the trick to be done here. So one way to do this is to use the different resolution preserving building blocks that Karen talked about a couple of weeks ago. So to reverse the pooling, then we can do a transposed convolution, which deconvolutes or upsamples. And we can also replace regular convolutions with a dilated convolution with a stride of 1. So let's see how that works. We can look at so like I said, in the usual, I guess this is a VGG net, in a usual network, we would have the input resolution, and then as we go through through the layers of this network, then we lose spatial resolution as we add feature layers. So the output here would be 21 different layers, but we don't any longer have any or much of any spatial resolution. So I've got 21 different layers representing 21 different classes, and I've got a probability for each of those layers whether or not there's an object there, but I am far too coarsely sampled, far too low of a resolution. So one way to do this is to simply say, well, I'm going to get to that point, and then I am going to upsample. And I'm going to use a transposed convolution, and that's going to increase the spatial resolution, and I'm going to get back to the scale, the resolution that I want, or stop somewhere in the middle at some intermediate scale. This does not work that well, as you might guess. Why? Because you're going through a bottleneck here where you're losing a lot of the information about where things are. So really what you're going to end up with if you train this is what we have here. You get blobs. They're nice blobs, but they're not really what we're looking for. So we basically have that semantic information as to what objects are there, but we've lost the positions. So one way to deal with this is to say, I like the information that's here that tells me what classes are in the image, but I need to know where they are. So that information should still be there in a previous layer. So what I'm going to do is to combine this representation with a skip connection from here. And I'm going to bring these two together and so I would have to do a 32x upsampled prediction. But if I have combined together a previous layer with the current convnet and learned that combination, right? So this can be a learned connection here, a learned fully connected, usually linear layer. Then what I can now do, now I've got a space that has the semantic information, has more resolution, and I can just do a 16x upsample to get something more like this. Or obviously I can repeat this. I can say, let me have actually information from further back in the architecture when I had even more higher resolution information, and bring that together and be able to now have a representation with features, more resolution. Now I can just do an 8x upsampled prediction of the actual mask and get a better result at the end. Yes?
The black arrows are learned connections, whereas when you show the grey arrow that is going down towards that layer, like the diamond, how's that?
To be honest, let's see here. We are taking this information and we are doing a 2x upsampling of this. So just repeating information every 2 by 2, right? And then we are combining it with, we're adding another layer that is that's just a copy, right? So now we would have 2 layers, and these are of course many feature layers here. But I've got one that I've simply copied the information to upsample it once, and I've added in another layer that gives the features. Then this upsampled, this transposed convolution that I'm doing here has more to work with. It's got both information at both layers, the coarse semantic information and also that. And then if I just keep on doing this at 2 by 2, then I get something that's more reasonable. This notion of having an architecture, by the way, that has a bottleneck, which is very useful for learning an abstract semantic, disentangled, however you want to call it, learns a good representation of the data, but combining that with a skip connection is very powerful architecture. And it's you see this theme coming up in different types of work. So if you guys looked at autoencoders, yes. So there you see that you have a similar sort of thing, even though that is would be trained in a different way, is an unsupervised approach. But where you want to start at some resolution of your data, you want to learn a representation that gets sort of narrower and narrower, goes through a bottleneck, and then you want to go back to some sort of back to a finer resolution, so you add these skip connections, right? So I've got this bottlenecked architecture and then these skip connections that help carry that information through the other side. So it's just sort of I find that there's a lot of different sort of applications of neural networks that end up, I often don't want the small amount of knowledge. I often want something a little bit bigger. And using skip connections to lower layers can be very helpful. And of course, this is the idea that grounds residual networks is having that residual or skip connection. Yes?
I mean, I imagine there is a difference, but what would be different would be if you pulled to the information from different pooled layers. So you pulled from 3 and 4, but is there a certain depth back before which your pooling is not actually that useful? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I also have the question as to why not go one step forward, and I'm not positive as to whether or not they did those experiments for this paper. Now, there is a nice paper by Jason Yosinski called "Do Deep Neural Networks Really Learn to transfer, I think. It's a question. Jason Yosinski. And it's just a really nice sort of examination of if I train this big, long network, then where do I want to actually draw knowledge from when I use this for a different task? And as you would expect, you do get that down here, I've got, you know, the information is very specific to the data, to that problem. And the features are very sort of low level. The features being low level means that it will transfer very easily. At a higher level, it tends to become more sort of problem specific. I think I said that the wrong way. The earlier layers are more general. The later you go in the network, then the more sort of problem specific you get, all the way to the layer where you're actually classifying a particular set of classes. There aren't any sort of magic answers, but it does give an interesting insight to this and some interesting experiments on it. For the most part, with this sort of an architecture, as with most deep learning, then there's a lot of empirical, you know, experiments to say, is it more useful to draw, you know, from pool 3 or pool 4, or both? I guess you'd have to from both. All right. Yes?
Just on that last slide. So is it kind of fair to say broadly that the classification is going on at the top layer, and you've used the skip connection just to come back and help it be visualised and presented, or is classification going on over the whole?
So the classification is going to be present there, but not explicitly. Here it is explicitly there, a class label, a class likelihood over each possible class. So here obviously the information is there, but what you get is a little bit more attention to the details. For instance, if one of your classes is a person, then at this level you're going to get clearly, yes, there is a person in the image, but back here you're going to get, I see an arm. I see another arm, I see a leg, I see another leg, and together that information gets put together. So, but of course, you could end up putting together that I see a leg and an arm and an arm, and at the end say it's actually, I don't know, a doll or a robot or something like that at the highest level, right? So you let the highest level make that final decision at the level of the class you're trying to predict. The lowest level can say, but if there's an arm here, then this is how I want to segment it, and an arm here. So make a decision and then come back down again, which is, I think, what we do. You know, if you ask a kid to outline things in an image, or adults, as you do for all of these labeled data sets, there's adults out there that are grad students, I don't know.
Would it help from our perspective to have the same label for one human intersecting with the other human? Because it feels like this is not going to generalize another problem that well, because you're not going to have humans ever looking necessarily like that.
Sorry, you're saying that you don't think that the training on this would generalize to?
Well, it feels like you have three humans next to each other and two are intersecting, and you're telling that the ground truth is that they're both like the same class.
Right. If that's all you had as what you're learning from, then it would be really hard to solve the problem. If all you had was, for instance, crowds of people where everything was overlapping. But luckily, that's the point of data sets being big enough that they capture lots of different things. And sometimes you will get humans that are, prototypical, and sometimes you're going to get more muddled scenes and more noise, things mislabeled, et cetera. What we sort of rely on when we train these things is that given enough data, we are going to get enough of a learning signal to be able to learn what we want. And indeed, these approaches work surprisingly well. What they don't do well on is, I don't think that there's an example here. You look at scenes where you have people are interested in doing semantic segmentation. I think that the number one reason why people want to do semantic segmentation in in industry is for autonomous cars. Because everybody wants to take a street scene and understand it. You've got LiDAR, you've got other sensors, but what you need to know is that a pedestrian and are they about to cross in front of the car? Understanding different aspects of the scene. So you want to do scene segmentation there and understand these different classes. And you look at the results that people have on these sort of big street scenes with cars and buildings and street signs and people and bicyclists, et cetera, and they do really well on parts of it, but then parts of it will be really, really poorly done, whereas humans can take just a couple of pixels in that image, given the context of the whole scene, and say, yeah, that's a telephone pole, that's not a human. So I'm both impressed where this sort of work has managed to get in the last 10 years or so, but also there's still a lot more work to go. All right. So another way to do this, let me just look ahead. No. Another way to do this is to, instead of using a regular convolution at all, you avoid the problem of having the reduced resolution. By using throughout the network, you can use a dilated convolution. And so this means that you are removing your pooling altogether. And you are replacing convolution with a dilated convolution with a step size of 1. So if you think about how that works, you're actually going to end up with, you have this broad receptive field, meaning you're looking at a larger part of the image to make a decision, which is one of the reasons why we do pooling, is so that a convolutional filter can have a receptive window that's broader on the scene so that you get more high-level information. But instead, we can sort of say, well, I'm just going to look at every other pixel, but I'm going to move this thing slowly across the whole image, right? So this allows you to have the same receptive field, but have no decrease in the resolution as you go through the layers of the network. And this gives you, it's sort of a simpler architecture because you don't need to worry about getting back up to the full resolution. And it also gives higher accuracy, because now you're really a little bit more just directly training for the type of information that you want. You're saying simultaneously, give me precision, pixel level precision, and give me high level information. And let the network weights sort of work out how to do this from this sort of a structure. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. All right, and video classification with ConvNets. I went to CVPR, which is the biggest conference that does computer vision, that works in the computer vision domain, and I was still struck by how many papers were there that were focusing on single images. The world is not presented to us as single images. Why aren't we working on video? But there's still a lot of work being done. But we do have means of doing classification and segmentation and all of these sorts of problems in videos. So here's a few different ways to do this. First of all, starting on the left, we can just say, well, I'm going to process one frame at a time, right? I'm going to pretend that my video is just a set of images that may or may not be related, and I'm just going to run a ConvNet through every single one of them. This is sort of like doing a sliding window approach to do detection using a classifier network. This is sort of exhaustively looking for dogs, for instance, by considering separately every single frame. This is inefficient, but moreover, it doesn't work well because the whole point of considering multiple frames is that you can build up your certainty over time. When I see just a couple pixels of a light post, and I'm trying to figure out if it's a light post or a person down the road, then I want to see more information. Just getting a few more samples can help me make that decision. So another way to do this is I'm going to run my classifier over all of the images, but then I'm going to train a layer that's going to, so imagine we're training the same, or we're running the same convolutional network independently over each frame in this video sequence, but then at the end, I'm taking the outputs of across all of those frames, and I'm training one network, one layer at the top to say, there's been a dog scene, there's been a human scene, something like that. So late fusion. Early fusion. Let's instead take advantage let's use the neural network to reason about multiple images at the same time. So instead we feed in a block of images. So instead of my input being RGB, now I've got n different images stacked up. And my convolutions then can go, in my ConvNet, can go across the image space in sort of XY, but they can also go through the time direction as well. So just a simple extension on your standard convolutional network, and everything is exactly the same. It's just now my input is a block of images rather than a single one. And we can call this an early fusion model. This means that my network all along the way, obviously I would need to fine tune this, but along the way I would be able to make a better decision because I'm looking at those features and motion at a lower level. Another approach would be slow fusion. And the idea here is that I'm going to do some of both. I'm going to run independent feature extractors, ConvNets, over each individual frame, but then I'm going to, in the middle, start to put these together. I will point out, this is for video classification, but we consider exactly the same gamut of different options. All right, yes, I'll take the question first.
Does this technique work when there's large amounts of movement between, like, say, the first and the 10th frame?
Does which approach work?
Sorry, like lead fusion or do they work?
So they do work. The thing that's sort of, that's not great here is that all of these approaches assume a fixed temporal window that I'm going to consider, right? They all assume that, for instance, that 10 frames is good enough to detect everything. So that means that you're not going to be able to see a glimpse of the tail of a dog and then the head of a dog, 20 frames later, and be able to say, I saw a dog. So, and you can always construct a case where you want to have a wider temporal window or where a narrower one would be better. This is exactly the motivation for using a recurrent neural network instead, which is probably what Oriel talked about last week, maybe, or did he talk about text? Yeah, okay. Yes?
To deal with that kind of high, well the problem is that your frame, not your frame rate, but your frame rate is 60 frames a second or something. To deal with the far back in time, did you not use like a dilated, do people use heavily dilated convolutions rather than?
Right. So you can definitely use a dilated convolution in over time and be able to get a much better field of view temporally in exactly the same way that we might want a broader field of view over the image space. And that's what's used for instance, PixelNet or WaveNet, PixelNet, WaveNet. These approaches, they process not PixelNet, because that would be pixels. WaveNet is an approach that does speech generation or audio generation, and it learns via dilated temporal convolutions. Exactly. The slight tangent that I wanted to mention is that we're talking here about video, about a single modality, but this is the same gamut of different approaches that we consider anytime when you have two modalities. So if I've got, say, audio and video, which is honestly what we should be looking at, not even just video. We sort of understand the world through the media of audio and video. Now you've got these two different modalities. How do I understand those? Do I process them completely separately and then at the end put them together and try to solve my problem? You know, do, I don't know, do speech recognition or some problem from there? Or do I somehow fuse together these different sensory modalities early on? We do the same thing in robotics. If I've got a robotic arm, then I want to be able to both process my image of that hand moving as well as the proprioception, which means what is the joint position, you know, my knowledge of how, what my joints are doing, their velocity, but also tactile information, right? Got these different sorts of information coming in. How can I combine those? What is the best way? And I think that this is an extremely interesting question because you can really, you can come up with arguments for any of these different approaches and with and without recurrent networks and et cetera. There isn't a best answer, but I think that there should be a little bit more principled research and understanding of why to use these, when and how to use the different architectures. Interestingly, all right, quick tangent too, in the brain they used to think, and I'm saying this from a colleague of mine, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I was told that that neuroscientists used to think that there was late fusion of different sensory modalities in the brain. So the way in which we process audio, the way we process vision, whatever else, then those get fused sort of at the end. So there's the independent things. And that was because you have your visual cortex, you have your auditory cortex, et cetera, and the two are relatively separate. Just recently, they've discovered actually there's all of these pathways that go in between. So that it maybe looks a little bit more like this, or like this, but with lateral connections here. So there's some separation there, different dedicated processing, but then there are all of these pathways of connections that allow the two to communicate so that you can get feedback early on in the cortical processing between what I'm hearing and seeing and touching, et cetera, which makes sense. Quick example of doing, of a specific means of processing video. The idea here is that we want to use two sources of information, one being the motion and one being the visual information. The idea is that maybe if we understand and sort of process these separately, that we can get a better result, better accuracy of doing action recognition. I'm pretty sure that this was for action recognition. In fact, I'm sure it was. So we train, or this is actually from Karen and Andrew Zisserman, you train two convnets. And one of them is going to have as its input a stack of images, and the other one is going to have as its input a single image. And what you're going to try to do here is you're going to train this with a loss that tries to predict the optical flow. And you're going to train this one with that is predicting, I don't remember. My guess is that you're predicting here that it's pre-trained using ImageNet. And then we've got a neural network layer, fully connected layer that has as its input the two output layers of these two different sort of pathways and unifies them and comes up with the single classification of what type of action is this. Okay. That's the end of that section. Maybe let's do the 5-minute break now and then I can jump into the next section. So this is a paper from a couple years ago from Max Jodderberg at DeepMind. And just to motivate it, let's think about convolutional neural networks. They have pooling layers. Why do they have pooling layers? Because we want more invariance, translational invariance. Right? We want to be able to have the same activations we want to pool together activations over broader areas. Or rather, sorry, convolutional layers give us translational invariance, or some amount of it, and pooling sort of accommodates different spatial translations to give a more uniform result and make the learning easier. Right.
Wasn't pooling for reducing gradual
So pooling does two things. Pooling increases the field of view for the next layer and says, now I'm looking at information over a bigger projection onto the original image so that I can make a higher level feature detection. But it also acts to say whether I saw the arm here or here or here or here, it's still an arm. So it works in concert with the convolutional operator, which is able to give a uniform detection across different areas. And it pools that together so that it just has representation of, yes, there was an arm, I don't care where it was. But this nice system only works strictly, only works for translations. And there's lots of other types of transformations that we're going to see, in particular in a visual scene. And it's hard-coded into the architecture as well. So various people have come up with cool architectures where now the weight tying is, instead of just having a convolution this way, then you also have weight tying across different rotations. And there's different ways to do this. It gets a little bit ugly, though. Right. But the usual thing is to just say, well, if I want to detect MNIST digits, that are turned upside down, or faces that are turned upside down, I'm just going to learn on a lot of data. So that basically then you need to learn to recognize 4s versus 7s when they're right side up and when they're sideways and when they're upside down. So you're making more work because you don't have anything that's in your architecture that's innate that will accommodate these sort of transformations. So let's learn to transform the input instead. Yes?
Is that not a reason why I've seen people augment the data set, so they would take the original images and then rotate them a bit?
Exactly. Exactly. So this is done routinely, called data augmentation, where I'm going to introduce some variations to my data so that I can learn across that. Obviously, it makes the learning harder, right? Now I've got a convnet that, yes, it recognizes rotations, and this is still the standard approach and a wise thing to do. This offers a different complementary approach that's sort of interesting because it's a way of tailoring what sort of invariances you want to your actual problem. So here's the challenge. I'm given data that looks like this, different orientations. Wouldn't it be nice if I had a magical transform that recognized what sort of transformations there are in my input space and got me to a canonical pose such that my convnet has a little bit less work to do?
Can I ask another question?
Yes.
So the lowest level filters that you see tend to look like Gabor filters. You have various rotations of those.
Mm-hmm.
So that surely is an example that the fundamental architecture isn't lacking in terms of being able to interpret rotated detail.
That's true in that you're right. These low level, the first layer of Gabor filters, what look like Gabor filters, are extremely general and have all of the rotations in them. But the problem is that in order to recognize this versus this, I need different filters to do that. So I would need the entire gamut of different filters, which we have, but that's to recognize that's to recognize different types of things. I mean, the problem is not at the first level, it's somewhere in the middle when I start wanting to put these together to recognize a 7, and I'd much rather be able to assume that a 7 always has a point going the, in the same orientation. If I have to recognize that particular little V feature that's distinctive of a 7 in all orientations, I have to have that at the next layer as well. So just having all rotations of my Gabor filters at the first level doesn't give me the rotational invariance at the next level, or at the highest level. All right, so if we were to make this differentiable, then ideally we'd be able to learn a transformation there that would be useful for exactly my data type, rather than saying externally, I want to build in rotation invariance. What if I don't know exactly what sort of problems there are in my data, or what the canonical pose that would be most useful? For faces, we have an idea. For other types of data, who knows? I just know that I've got a lot of data, it's got a lot of different variants in it. Is there some way of making this a little bit more homogeneous so that when I apply my convnet, it doesn't have to work quite so hard? So that's the idea of learning T, learning something that will transform this to make it understood. We can think about this more generally. This goes back to your question. Those first level Gabor filters are pretty useful and pretty general already. Maybe I want to just keep those here. Maybe I just want to have something that I can insert between two layers to say, take this input, take this output from one layer of my processing and transform it before you feed it into the next layer, and learn how to do this. Then you might get that this transformation here is not very useful, so you would hope to just learn an identity there. This might be the useful one where I would want to get some sort of rotation, for instance, to a canonical pose. So this is the convolutional network in a nutshell. The idea is that, again, I'm imagining that this is planted between two other layers of processing. So I have some input U, previous feature layers. What I want to do is to first predict theta. So these are the parameters for some set of transformations. That parameterizes this function tau, which is my grid generator. That's going to produce a sampling grid. The output of this is an actual sampler, which is going to take the features in U and turn it into my input into my next layer of processing V.
Would you not want a illumination transformer as well, maybe, if you were going to go through the input thing and spatial transformer? Or is that not really related?
Illumination is fairly, sure, yes, you could. Illumination, you're right, you could get a better normalization than you would get through the bias correction that you get sort of for free in a convolutional network. The bias correction that you get in a convnet is going to apply to the whole feature layer. So you're right, you might get a nice sort of normalization of it if you could do something a little bit different. Often illumination does get handled fairly well by a convnet already, as long as you don't train it on dark images and then try to test on outside of the set. This relies, in order to make this differentiable, then we want to have components which are differentiable. So here we consider these three components. Like I said, first we have something which is called the localization net, which is going to be a trainable function that's really doing all of the work here. This is the thing that's where we're actually optimizing parameters. That's going to map our features to our transformation function. The grid generator is going to take those parameters that have been inferred from my current input, theta, and create a sampling grid, and then the actual sampler is going to do the transformation and feed into the next layer. So this is simply, I am going to use R6 because we'll start out by just thinking about affine transformations. There are different types of, that's the one thing that you do need to define, is you do need to say, what is my transformation function that I am going to be embedding here? The rest of it, the actual parameters of it, what that transformation is going to be determined by this localization net per each image that comes in, which is why we're not just applying a general rotation to all of the images, but each one is going to be rotated or transformed separately. But one could use this same approach and have many different types of functions embedded there. So we have a trainable, so first of all, the localization network is a trainable function that's going to act on the outputs of U and produce theta. And so our forward pass just looks like normal inference with a neural network of your choice, with a neural layer of your choice. Some sets of weights. Right, second component, the grid generator. So this is parameterized by the theta, which we have inferred. And this generates an output map. And so we're going to have a output, we're going to take our parameters theta, and we're going to produce something that is in the same size, the same dimensions of V, of where we are going into. And then the last piece of, still on the grid generator. So this is the forward pass that we would use for affine transforms, to be specific about it. The 6 estimates of theta that give that rotation, translation, scale. And so we can think about this as being that the output of the grid generator is a sampling grid that says for each component in that for x, s, and ys, then I'm going to index into my input map to figure out where I should sample that to get my new output. And the sampler is going to actually do the sampling to apply a kernel function to say where in, or how am I going to go from U to V based on the mapping given to me with X, S, YS. And the forward pass there then looks like this general formula, which uses some kernel function. And then we can look at this for a particular transformation or a particular sampler, such as bilinear interpolation, and that gets me to a specific formula for what that sampler is going to look like for the forward pass. And as long as this is differentiable with respect to x and y, then you're good. And I think it is for all kernels. Right, so now we need to go in the opposite direction. So we've looked at our forward pass, localization network, the grid generator, the sampler, and that creates the new input, and then we proceed onwards. As we're coming backwards through the network, we want to first backpropagate through that bilinear sampler to get the derivatives of V with respect to U and X and Y. Right? So here we've got the gradients going this way, the gradients going that way. And so this is the derivative of V with respect to U, going through that bilinear interpolation. And this is with respect to xi and yi would be the same. And this has discontinuities in it, so we use subgradients because of the max. Next, we want to backprop through the grid generator, the function tau. And we need to, because we want to get to the derivative of x and y with respect to theta, with respect to our output from the localization network. And last, we are going to backprop the localization network in the usual way, because that's a neural layer. So it's just going to be a set of weights and a bias, maybe a nonlinearity. And that will give us the gradient of theta with respect to u. And that, sorry, and then we can obviously continue to backprop through whatever other things we have in our network stack at that point. But really, this is just a matter of sort of choosing things to begin with that were reasonably differentiable, even if there's discontinuities, and being able to have that produce those gradients. So let's take a look at how this works. Maybe this video is working. I don't have any control over the video. All right, so this video actually started earlier. So what do we see happening here? These are two different, so these are an affine function that's been used there. Darn it. Okay. I can step through it. Okay, so there's a bunch of experiments that were done on this, almost all of them with MNIST, although not all. And the idea here is to try different types of transformations, such as a thin plate spline versus an affine transformation, as the sort of chosen space of functions. And then we can see how it does. And what we're seeing first on the left is what the input is. And all we're trying to do here, note that the only way that we're training this is by trying to predict what the digit is. Right? We're just trying to predict if it's a 5. So this means that it's up to the network to produce this spatial transformer. Like I said, this could just end up being identity, and that is exactly what you get if your inputs are relatively well normalized, centered, etc. But if you start moving them around, then what you learn is this transformation that gives you in the output after that spatial transformer is quite stable. It's not completely stable, but it's stable enough for the rest of the ConvNet to do a better job on this. And that's sort of the important take-home here. This was also used for MNIST addition. So I've now got two channels being fed in together, and we have two different spatial transformers. One learns to stabilize channel 1, the other one learns to transform channel 2. And in this case, the only thing that we're training it on is what 3 plus 8 is, right? Is what the output is of image A plus image B, which makes it into a harder problem and just demonstrates that you can still learn through this complex architecture and get something reasonable. Lots of moving things. Yeah, right. More moving things with noise. Right. this? There we go. Okay, next I'd like to talk about,
Can I ask a question about that?
yes you can.
What was 6 and 9 performance like?
I don't remember. It's a good question. Obviously, 6 and 9 is a little bit of a problem. I'm not sure if they constrained it to not be a full rotation for that reason. That'd be a problem for you as well, I would point out. There's no magic here. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you explain why we need sampling between the original image?
Because otherwise, if you don't use a kernel to sample the input, then what you're going to get in the output is something that is has holes in it and is less accurate. That's why if you're sampling an image into a warp, some transform, then you need to use a kernel. At least bilinear interpolation is going to give you something smoother than using nearest neighbor, which is going to give you something smoother than just using the targeted pixel.
So does it give us more variance or not about variance at all?
No, it's just about retaining more of the information content. I mean, imagine that my transformation is zooming in. Then I'm going to be sampling a lot all in one area. And you're going to end up with it being, the areas between different pixels get sort of blown up and distorted. And it's not going to look smooth. It's the same thing you get if you try with different sampling techniques in your, just an image processing program on the computer. You get quite different results if you use different types of kernel sampling.
Just in the general, sampling with the kernel, so there's no randomness involved in that.
No, the only learned part there is in the theta, is in the localization net. The rest of it is just turn the crank. It's just machinery put in place that we can backprop through.
Okay, so in this case, sampling is just reducing.
The sampling is what's actually transforming the output of U into something normalized that we feed into V.
Okay, so there's no distribution there.
No, not sampling in that sense. All right. We good to go? Yes, okay. It's a nice paper. If you want a nice read on this method, I enjoy the spatial transformer paper. All right. Learning relationship. So rather than learning classification or regression, sometimes that's not the goal. Sometimes we just want to know similarity and dissimilarity, for instance. So I don't want to know, enough said. Sometimes we want to do visualization, in which case it's not really interesting to do classification. We want to know how a bunch of data is all related. And so for the purpose of visualization, I might want to infer relationships between things. If I understand X and Y, how do I relate Z to X and Y? I might want to do clustering, or I might want to understand something fundamental about the underlying structure of a set of data. So these are all cases in which it may not be helpful or possible to do a standard supervised learning approach like classification or regression. Fundamentally, they all relate to taking something that's high dimensional and producing something that is low dimensional, but that still captures some properties of the data that we care about. And we call that, people are quite loose in their terminology there, but this is generally called the embedding of the data or the manifold of the data learning. So one way to do this that people often use, if they've trained a ImageNet network, for instance, for classification, or you can just simply take off the classification layer, and then you can say, aha, there's my embedding, right? There's my feature space, maybe 100-dimensional or something higher. But I'm just going to say that is my manifold of the data, and that works for some cases. And you might do this, but you may not have any training labels, or you might want to generalize to new classes, in which case having this, this trained doesn't really make sense. So, different way to do this is to think about this in terms of not supervised learning, where we associate each input with a label, but instead have embedding losses, which associate inputs with each other. Right? So, fundamental idea here, pull similar things together, push dissimilar things apart in that manifold space. Right? These are dissimilar, but they look similar. We want these to be separate. We don't want these to get mapped together. If you looked at pixel-wise similarities, those are going to be maybe not nearest neighbors, but pretty close, right? In our pixel space. We want to learn a space where these are far apart. These are both buses. We want them to be mapped together. So that's an example of where we're actually taking the label of the object. So we could just do supervised learning on these, or we could use these labels in other ways. And there might be other reasons why we have information about which things are similar and which things are different. We'll get back to that in a moment. All right, so how do we design losses for this? If now I just have a relationship between two inputs rather than a label that I'm trying to predict. So typically, all of these approaches involve distances in feature space, often an L2 distance. So one example is a contrastive squared loss. So here we say that I'm going to take two inputs, xi and xj, and I'm going to take a label, but this is a similarity label, so it says either these are similar or these are different for xi and xj. And I am going to have my loss function is going to say that I am going to pay, if yij equals 1, which means that these are similar, then I want them to be close in my feature space, and I'm going to pay a cost if they are far apart, quadratic cost for them being far apart. If they are, if yi equals -1, which means that they are dissimilar, then I'm going to pay a cost for having them close together, and I want to push them further apart up to a margin. If you don't have this margin M on your space, then you will be trying to push things, explode it, push things infinitely far apart. It's not well constrained. So this is a contrastive squared loss where I've got two different penalties depending on which samples I have, and if I want to pull them closer in my space, which is a function f, or if I want to push them further apart. And I train my network with this, and it's sort of like an energy system where I'm going to be just trying to rearrange my feature space such that these different things are, these two different constraints work out. Pardon me? The x-axis would be the distance in the feature space, the Euclidean distance between f of xi and f of xj, and the y-axis is the cost, is the loss. And so this can be trained using something that has been called a Siamese network, where I have an identical copy of f. I pass xi through f, I pass xj through f, I compute this distance, Euclidean distance between them in their feature space, and then I'm going to backprop through the network. And since they share weights, then both sides are updated. We can use different losses. This uses a cosine similarity loss. So here we have that our distance d is the cosine similarity between f of xi and f of xj. And I have forgotten. There's some work that sort of compares and contrasts between these two different losses for similarities. I've honestly forgotten what the result of it was that method C, which is the next one, worked better. I don't remember what the comparison was between the first two that I showed. So the third formulation that's often used and that I'd say is most common now is called a triplet loss. And the triplet loss, let's see if I have another. The idea here is that I'm going to have 3 points that are input. So I've got XA, XS, and XD. And what I know is simply the relative information that XD is, XS is more similar to the anchor than XD is. So what you want to do is push and pull the system, train your weights such that you go from that from that to that. So you're never trying to completely pull two elements together, and you're never trying to push two elements completely apart. You're just saying relative, if I take 3 things, I want to pull one closer and push one further away. And this works very well. It's nice and general. It's balanced. The training works well, doesn't explode. And the loss function is just as you would think, that you're going to try to the distance between the dissimilar one, you're going to pay a penalty if that is much larger than the distance from the similar one. And there's a margin there as well. And how are these used? So one interesting way in which they're used is that all of the face detection algorithms that are out there these days all use this approach. And why is that? Well, that's because people used to do face recognition by saying, okay, I'm going to take 100 people and take a bunch of photos of each one, and I want to be able to recognize, I'm going to classify each of those people. So I'm going to recognize by name, by ID, each of those people, and that's how I'm going to tell if 2 people are different, is if they come up with different IDs when I run a classifier on their faces. Or if they're same, they come up with the same ID. This is a problem when you have lots and lots of people, right? So Facebook has too many people to be able to use anything like this. It doesn't scale to use a classifier. Instead, all you want to know is, given 2 images, are they the same person or are they different people? So instead you use this method of training an embedding space, and then all you have to look at is the distance in that really nice feature space that you've made. And that will tell you what the likelihood is that 2 images are of the same person. And I don't any longer need to actually keep obviously the IDs are there, but you don't need to explicitly learn using those IDs. So for instance, this is from Facenet. DeepFace, I think, is the best one currently, but that might be a little bit old. But this is from Facenet, which is also very good. These are all images of the same person. And they're all taken as nearest neighbors from one image in the feature space. So you can tell by that if those are all nearest neighbors of one point, then you've learned something that's really, really robust to all the different ways in which people can appear. Yes?
Can any of those losses be modified to account for an input that's not binary? Because right now we're saying similar dissimilar.
Similar dissimilar. Yeah. You get that to some extent with the triplet loss. But yes, you could definitely take the original, the contrastive squared loss, and you can, instead of just using a binary class on that, then you could use a continuous class, and that will simply change how it works. So there has been a couple papers that have done that. And on the other side of it, so that's how well it works, these are false accepts. So each of these pairs, pair, 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 those are all incorrectly matched by deep face as well, or Facenet. So incorrectly, it thought that these two were the same person. And clearly, they're completely different people. So yes, we would make most of the same. So these facial recognition networks are now better, significantly better than humans can do on the same problem. Although that's from a data set. I think that humans do better if you actually know the person, right? So the people that we know, that we work with, and our families, our friends, et cetera, we still luckily beat the ConvNets at robustly recognizing the identity of those images. But if it's just a data set, then we lose. All right, I have maybe 15 minutes left. I was going to run through something that I worked on. Does that sound all right? Okay. So it probably uses a bunch of things in DeepRL that you guys have not covered yet, but yes.
So before you jump to that, can we use this sort of thing to approach together also kind of semantic relationships rather than just like a face looks like a face, but say a board goes with a pen and not with a cup of coffee, and then can we do that, or is it something?
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways. That's one of the cool things about it, is that there's a lot of different ways of getting those relationship labels, right? So you can take images, take lots and lots of images, and just say, well, if two objects appear together next to each other, then yes, we should definitely say that these two things have some similarity to them. If I never see two things together, they should be different and distant in the feature space. And then you get something that will group together office stuff versus outdoor stuff, et cetera. You can also use this, so somebody used this to say, I don't understand this biological data that I'm getting in some test that was being done on cancer patients. I don't understand this. I don't know what the structure is. But I do know that I get these readings from individual patients. So they just said, let's group these together, right? And then just say that if these readings come from the same patient, then they should have some similarity. I think it was from 2 different tests that were being done that were not obviously correlated. But they discovered a sort of an unknown structure in different types of cancer because of this. And that was just a matter of saying, there's a relationship between these because they're coming from the same person. You can also use this for temporal information. So you can just say that in streaming video, frames that are close to each other should be more similar than frames that are further apart from each other. And then you get something that's often referred to as slow features. You get this very different sort of features where you get where things are very invariant over short amounts of time or transformations. Anyway, so yes, very, very broad area. You can do a lot of different things with these approaches. All right, so I like navigation. Navigation's a fun problem. We all navigate. I navigate, you navigate. I wanted to make a problem in a simulator that I could try different deep reinforcement learning approaches on. And I started working on this at a time when DeepMind was just working on Atari. And I really wanted to go beyond Atari in terms of a set of interesting problems. And so navigation mazes have the problem of that if you can look at the maze from here, you can solve the maze. If you're looking at it from there, it becomes much more challenging because you only have partial observability of the domain. So I need to remember things over time. And I need to learn to recognize structure just from a visual input. So I worked with my colleagues at DeepMind. We developed a simulator to procedurally produce these mazes. And we made up a game that says, I'm going to start somewhere in this maze, anywhere in this maze, and I'm going to try to find the goal. If I find the goal, I get plus 10 points, and I immediately get teleported somewhere else, and I have to find my way back again. And I'm going to repeat that as quickly as I can for a fixed episode length, right? wander around the maze, find the goal, get teleported elsewhere, find your way back again, get teleported, find your way back. That's the goal. There's also some apples laying around. These help with getting the learning off the ground. We found out later they're not necessary, but they're there because we assumed initially that we would need those in order to start the learning process. We can look at different variants here. So we could say, well, we've got a static maze and a static goal, and the thing that changes is where the agent gets spawned, where you start and where you get teleported to. Or we can say, well, the maze layout is fixed, but I've got a goal that moves around on every episode. Or I can say everything is random all the time. And the inputs I get are the RGB image and then my velocity, just my instantaneous velocity in agent relative coordinate frame. And I can take actions that involve moving sideways, forward, backwards, rotating, looking around. And I can look at a few different mazes. We have a large one, takes about 5 minutes per episode, almost 11,000 steps in an episode, so longer space of time and bigger mazes. And we also have that little, what we call the eye maze, where the goal only appears in the 4 corners, and the agent always starts somewhere in the middle here. And you really just, you know exactly the behavior you want. You want the agent to methodically check the 4 corners. When it finds the goal, just immediately go back there again. But you can see from these sorts of traces, this is after learning that it finds the goal and then goes back there again and again throughout the episode. So that's the problem in a very quick nutshell. What we have is sparse rewards. It makes this, we can train an agent using sort of standard deep reinforcement learning methods on the game I presented, but it's slow. It is hard to do. It's slow. It takes a long time, very data inefficient. We discovered that we could substantially accelerate the speed of the learning if we used auxiliary losses. So this means that instead of just trying to maximize reward through learning a value function, and updating the policy, I'm also at the same time going to predict simple things in my environment, just using supervised learning or unsupervised learning, depending on how you want to call it. And we decided to try using depth prediction and loop closure prediction. So what is, and I will tell you what that means more in a moment. First of all, let's take a look at the architecture that we used. So our input is RGB images, feed it through a convolutional encoder, 3 layers. Then we add a 2-layer LSTM. So we need to have memory for this task, right? I need to be able to get to the goal and then remember where it was so I can efficiently get back to it. So we know that we need memory. We use an LSTM, we use 2. 2 is better. And we have a skip connection from the ConvNet. I said skip connections are useful general tools, and that helps the learning. We can add some additional inputs to the system. The instantaneous velocity, like I said, just in agent relative coordinates, how fast I'm moving laterally and rotationally. Previous action, previous reward. And then we train this using A3C, which is asynchronous advantage actor critic, which you will know about by the end of this course if you don't know now, but it is a method for policy gradient learning where we use the k-step advantage function to update the value. And we use the thing that we are really interested in here is the auxiliary tasks. So we're going to predict depth. By that I mean the input to the system is actually R, G, B, and D, the depth in the image space, right? How far away things are. We're going to not give that as an input, but instead try to predict it. And we can try to predict it as a MLP on the convolutional features, or we can do it off of the LSTM. But we're trying to predict that depth channel and just a subsampled version of it, a coarse prediction of the depth of that image. We also tried experimenting with loop closure prediction. So this is just a Bernoulli loss. We're going to predict at each time step, have we been here before at this place in the maze in this episode? And so that's off of the LSTM because we need memory for that one. And then we actually add a position encoder, which we don't, we just use this as a decoder, but we don't backprop gradients through. It's just to say, can I predict the position of the agent from what it's thinking? A little heartbeat, stethoscope. This produces a plumbing. I'm going to skip this. It's in the paper if you're interested. And we're just going to combine all of those different losses together. By the way, the auxiliary losses and the RL loss, we're just going to add them all together and backpropagate. Yes.
How difficult was it to figure out where to put those prediction tasks? Did you just
There aren't that many that you can. This was one of the main questions, was whether or not, obviously this is something about the visual system, and we knew from some related work that this could accelerate learning. We didn't know if it would work to have the gradients have to pass through two LSTMs to get to the visual feature layers, but that actually works very well. There aren't that many different places you can attach these things, and it's relatively easy to test the effect of it. All right, so different architectures. On the left, the plain vanilla A3C feed forward, no memory. B, we add on an LSTM, make it recurrent. C, what we call our nav A3C, we've added our additional inputs, our additional plumbing and additional LSTM. And then the last one where we add on our auxiliary losses, auxiliary tasks. Yeah. Okay, so how does this look on a large maze? Won't show the video yet. Okay, so these are learning curves. This is over 100 million steps of experience in this maze, and this is what we get with the vanilla agent without memory. It can't solve the task very well. It can just learn to be a speedy explorer, but it can't learn to really remember where it is and get back to the goal. And we ran five seeds for each one, and we show the mean. If we add the LSTM, the second agent that I showed there, then we do much better, but you can say that it takes a long time to learn before we get to that inflection point where we actually figure out where the agent figures out what's going on. And that's what we typically see with LSTMs, by the way. If we add the additional inputs and the additional LSTM, then it's about the same. Gets a little bit more unstable. If we add loop closure prediction, then we get fairly unstable performance from using that, because often there's not a strong gradient signal, because often you don't close the loop again in these mazes. But it does give enough information that you can see that that inflection point all of a sudden moves to the left by, a day in terms of training this, which is nice to see. If we add on the depth prediction, wow, we're way over there all of a sudden. Now all of a sudden we're getting to almost peak top performance very, 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 very quickly. And this is remarkable to see what the difference it makes in this task. And we see that it helps in all of the tasks that we tried, not always this dramatically, but it always improves. If we use D2 is placing the depth prediction on the LSTM instead. A little bit later to start off, but doesn't really matter, and it finishes just a smidge higher performance. We can put together D1, D2, and L, so with the loop closure. Doesn't really change things too much, and for reference, that's where a human expert gets to. Does much better than I do. I only get 110 points.
When you say human expert, so
at DeepMind, we have not one, but two dedicated video game players that put in a hard 40-hour week of playing various games we throw at them. I have to say there's some that they don't like very much. The mazes were not too bad. There were some that were pretty unpleasant for them because they tend to be quite easy. Atari, those are fun. Some of the other things that we've done are fun. But some things, when we're asking them to repeat playing it 20 to 100 times, but it's a really trivial game, then they get annoyed at us. But yes, so they are professionals, and I must say that there's a lot of skill involved. I mean, I can't come close to their performance on various things. It's interesting. We actually also tend to, if we develop a task at DeepMind, we will say, I want to look for how we use memory, or different types of things, or attention, or something like that. We develop a task, and we have our human experts learn to play it, and then we interview them. We ask them, what was your process of learning how to do this? What did you feel? What were the key things? What were you looking at? What were you observing? What was hard? And that can be really, really interesting, really informative.
Maybe you allowed like a piece of paper, say,
I'm not sure that they've ever had a task where they've wanted to have that, but we would probably let them do that. We just try to not give them, we actually, for this, because depth was an important element, then we did give them stereo goggles to look at a representation so that they had a heightened sense of depth to see what difference that made, which didn't make any. All right, so just have 1 minute left. Let me skip past that video. I'll show a video at the end. So an important question is if depth gives such an amazing difference, then why not just give it as an input, right? Why give it as a prediction target instead? And the answer is that actually works much better. So we compared between, if we had an architecture like this on the left, where we fed in RGBD. We just said, okay, here's the depth, full resolution, the whole thing. Then we actually don't learn as well as if we have to predict it. And that's because the important thing here is not the actual depth information, it's the gradients. The gradients sort of scaffold the very noisy learning that goes on with reinforcement learning. If these very noisy gradients coming from reinforcement learning, if I can on every frame give something meaningful that lets the network learn something about the structure of the scene and turn from a set of pixels into something that's a little bit more coherent, then it works better. We showed that the agent is remembering the goal location because it gets to the goal faster. At least on the smaller mazes. And then position decoding, it knows where it is, and then you can just see it sort of zooming around here. So this is on the iMaze, where it's going to check the corners, and it just found the goal on this arm of the maze. And now it's just going to repeatedly, for the rest of the 90 seconds or so of the episode, it's just going to repeatedly come back here again because it remembered where it was. An easy task, but we wanted to see this. This is in a larger maze. We show that we can decode the position of the agent using that non-backpropped position decoder. You can see it just zooming through very effectively. When it got to the goal, it got respawned somewhere else. Has to come back again. Last thing that I did want to show here. Whoops. So this is because in the mazes that are static, so the maze layout is static and only the goal position changes, then it knows just where it is. It doesn't need to go forwards, it can go backwards because it's really memorized that maze. As soon as you train it in a maze that can change, where the topology of it changes over time, or changes with each episode, then you see that it pays a little bit more attention. It doesn't do the same nice sliding moves.
That must also be because there's no cost to hitting the wall.
That's true. If you put in a cost of hitting the wall, then it does worse.
Is there signs on the walls to break symmetry?
Yes, exactly, and to help with the memory system. And we have actually shown that it's not, the agent does not use that. The human does. One of the things we asked the human expert, are the paintings on the wall useful for recognizing where you are? And they said, yes, absolutely. The agent, we can take the paintings away and you lose like an epsilon of performance. So
How does the agent?
it integrates over time. So if it's in an ambiguous space, then it can just go down the hall and it just uses the LSTM to accumulate evidence about where it is.
What if you remove the pattern from the walls? Like, what if you make them just straight yellow instead of...
Hold on, this is what I wanted to show. This is the actual thing that's being predicted by the agent. That's the auxiliary loss that makes all the difference there. You can see that it gives, that it's predicting coarsely something about the geometry of the scene. But it's interesting. What if you make it really empty? I think it would probably do fine. I have not tried that specifically, but we have tried with more and less complex sort of wall textures, and that has not made a difference. All right, I am all done. Thank you very much.